Chapter 1. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Willowbrook Senior Care as Marcus Chen pulled his Tesla into his usual spot. At 38, he had built a successful tech company from nothing, driven by a hunger that gnawed at him since childhood. The social workers at St. Catherine's Orphanage had told him he was found on their doorstep in Minneapolis during a January blizzard, wrapped in a thin blanket with no note, no name, nothing but the cold Minnesota wind as witness to his abandonment. That emptiness had propelled him through MIT, through countless 18-hour days building his startup, through every achievement that should have filled the void but never quite did. He grabbed the paper bag from Goldstein's Deli on the passenger seat, the aroma of fresh bagels and lox filling the car. This had become his Thursday ritual for the past 6 months, ever since he'd started volunteering at the facility. His therapist had suggested it might help with what she called his attachment issues, though Marcus suspected she just wanted him to stop working 90-hour weeks. The facility director, Mrs. Patterson, had paired him with Eleanor, a 73-year-old woman who rarely received visitors and spent most days staring out her window at the oak trees that lined the property. Walking through the pristine hallways that smelled of industrial disinfectant, barely masking something more human and finite, Marcus nodded to the staff members who had come to know him. The CNN playing in the common room reported on another tech merger while residents sat in wheelchairs, some alert, others lost in memories or medication. He found Eleanor in her usual spot by the window in room 247. Her thin frame wrapped in a burgundy cardigan despite the warmth of the heated building. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her hands, spotted with age but still elegant, rested on a photo album in her lap. "Good morning, Eleanor," Marcus said, pulling up the visitor's chair that had become as familiar as his office chair downtown. "I brought breakfast from Goldstein's. They had those everything bagels you mentioned last week." She turned slowly, and when her grey eyes met his, there was that flicker of something he could never quite identify: recognition, regret. Her voice, when it came, carried the slight tremor of age, but maintained a dignity that suggested she had once commanded rooms. "You're too kind, Marcus. You really shouldn't spend your money on an old woman with nowhere to go. It's just bagels, Eleanor. Besides, I enjoy our conversation." He unpacked the food, setting it on the small table between them. It was true, though he couldn't explain why. Something about her stories, fragmented as they were, pulled at him. She spoke of Minneapolis in the 80s, of working 3 jobs to make ends meet, of difficult choices that haunted her nights. Sometimes she mentioned a love that had died too young, leaving her with burdens she couldn't carry and decisions no mother should have to make. "Tell me about your week," she said, taking small bites of the bagel, her movements careful and deliberate. "How's that company of yours? Still changing the world one algorithm at a time?" Marcus smiled, appreciating her gentle teasing. She was one of the few people who didn't seem impressed by his success, who saw through the Forbes articles and TED Talks to something more essential. "We're launching a new platform next month. It's designed to help connect families separated by the foster system." He watched her carefully as he spoke, noting how her hands stilled on her cup of tea. "It uses facial recognition and DNA database integration to reunite siblings, parents, children who've lost touch." Eleanor's eyes glistened, and she looked back toward the window where a cardinal perched on a bare branch. "Some separations are meant to protect," she said quietly. "Sometimes love means letting go, even when it tears you apart, even when you know you'll spend every remaining day wondering what became of them." "But wouldn't you want to know?" Marcus pressed, leaning forward. "If you had lost someone, wouldn't you want the chance to find them again?" She studied his face then, her gaze traveling across his features with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. He had his mother's eyes, people always said, though of course they couldn't know that. Dark brown, almost black, with natural creases at the corners that suggested easy laughter even when he wasn't smiling. Eleanor reached out suddenly, her fingers almost touching his cheek before she pulled back. clenching her hand in her lap. Chapter 2. The weeks passed with the rhythm of routine, but something had shifted after that morning. Eleanor began sharing more specific memories, as if Marcus's presence had unlocked doors she'd kept bolted for decades. She told him about the winter of 1986, how the pipes in her apartment had frozen and she'd had to choose between formula and heating oil. She spoke of standing outside St. Catherine's Orphanage at 3 a.m, watching the snow fall, knowing that inside those walls her baby would be warm, fed, educated, given chances she could never provide. Marcus recorded these conversations with her permission, telling himself it was for his company's oral history project. But really, he was searching for something in her words, some clue to his own story. His adoptive parents, wonderful as they had been before the car accident took them, had never been able to tell him anything about his birth mother. The records were sealed, the trail cold, and he'd eventually stopped looking, channeling that energy into building something from nothing, proving his worth to a ghost who might not even be alive to see it. One Thursday in late November, Marcus arrived to find Eleanor more agitated than usual. She was pacing her small room, her photo album scattered across her bed. "They want to move me to the memory unit," she said, her voice tight with fear. "Mrs. Patterson says I've been confused, that I called out a name in my sleep, that I've been wandering the halls at night looking for someone." "What name?" Marcus asked, helping her gather the photographs. His hand froze as he picked up one picture, yellowed and creased. It showed a young woman, perhaps 25, holding a baby in what looked like a hospital room. The woman's face was turned partially away, but something about the curve of her jaw, the way she held the child, sent a jolt through him. "Benjamin," Eleanor whispered, taking the photo from him with shaking hands. "I called for Benjamin, that was his name, for the 3 days I had him, before I had to give him up." January 15th, 1986. The coldest night Minneapolis had seen in 50 years. Marcus felt the room spin slightly. His birthday, his official birthday, assigned by the orphanage, was January 18th, 1986. They'd assumed he was 3 days old when he was found. He watched Eleanor trace the baby's face in the photograph, humming something under her breath, a melody that made his chest tighten with inexplicable familiarity. "Eleanor," he said carefully, his voice sounding strange to his own ears, "what happened to Benjamin's father?" She looked up at him, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "Car accident. 2 months before Benjamin was born. David was coming home from his shift at the factory, hit black ice on 394. I was 23, no family, no insurance, nothing but a baby growing inside me, and grief so heavy I could barely stand." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I tried. God knows I tried. But when the eviction notice came, when I hadn't eaten in 3 days so I could afford formula, I knew. Love sometimes means admitting you're not enough, that your child deserves more than you can give." Marcus stood abruptly, his chest tight. "I need to make a call. I'll be right back." He stepped into the hallway, pulling out his phone to call his assistant. "Sarah, I need you to run something for me. Access the Minnesota Adoption Records database we've been building. Look for any infant boys abandoned at St. Catherine's Orphanage between January 15th and 18th, 1986. And Sarah, run my DNA profile against any maternal matches in the system." He returned to find Eleanor had moved back to the window, the photo clutched to her chest. She was humming again, louder this time, and the melody hit him like a physical blow. He knew this song. It had haunted his dreams for 38 years, a lullaby without words, a phantom comfort in his loneliest moments. His phone buzzed with Sarah's response, but he didn't need to look at it. He knew. "Eleanor," he said softly, approaching her slowly as if she might disappear. "The song you're humming, sing the words for me." She turned, her eyes meeting his, and in a voice cracked with age and sorrow she sang, "Sleep now, my Benjamin, dream of the morning light. Though I must leave you, my love stays through the night. When you wake tomorrow in arms that aren't my own, remember, little one, you'll never be alone." Chapter 3. Marcus's hands trembled as he pulled a chair close to Eleanor, his mind struggling to process what his heart already knew. The DNA results on his phone confirmed it with 99 and 97% certainty, but he didn't need science to tell him what he saw reflected in her eyes. The same unusual fleck of gold in the left iris that he saw in the mirror every morning. Eleanor seemed to sense the shift in the air between them, her frail body tensing as if preparing for judgment or flight. "Tell me about that night," Marcus said quietly, his voice thick with emotion he couldn't quite name. "The night you left Benjamin at St. Catherine's." Eleanor's fingers worried the edge of the photograph, her voice barely above a whisper. "I walked 4 miles through the snow, carrying him against my chest inside my coat. He was so quiet, like he knew. I had written a note, rewrote it 20 times, but when I got there I couldn't leave it. What could I say? That I loved him too much to watch him hungry, that I was too proud to go to shelters but not too proud to abandon him." She laughed bitterly. I kissed his forehead, told him his name one last time and rang the doorbell. I hid behind the dumpster until I saw Sister Margaret open the door, saw her take him inside. Then I walked home and spent the next 38 years wondering if I'd done the right thing. Marcus reached for his phone, scrolling through the photos until he found one from his MIT graduation. His adoptive parents stood on either side of him, beaming with pride. "The Chens adopted me when I was 6 months old," he said, showing her the picture. "They were professors, couldn't have children of their own. They loved me, gave me everything, education, opportunities, love. They died when I was 25, but not before I'd made them proud." Eleanor took the phone with shaking hands, tears falling freely onto the screen. "You became someone," she breathed. "Oh God, you became everything I hoped you'd be." "I became someone who spent his whole life looking for you," Marcus corrected gently. "Every success, every achievement, part of me was trying to prove I was worth keeping, that whoever left me had made a mistake." He took her hands in his, feeling how small they were, how the bones felt like bird wings beneath paper-thin skin. "But you didn't abandon me, did you? You saved me, from poverty, from struggle, from a life that would have limited what I could become." Eleanor sobbed then, a sound that seemed to come from the very depths of her soul. "I looked for you," she gasped between tears. "When you would have turned 18, I went back to St. Catherine's, but they said the records were sealed. I hired a detective with money I didn't have, but there was nothing. The Chens had moved, left no forwarding address. I thought maybe you didn't want to be found, that you hated me." "How did you end up here?" Marcus asked, his own tears falling now, 38 years of wondering suddenly overwhelming him. "No family, no savings," Eleanor explained, her voice hollow. "I never married, never had other children. How could I? I'd already had my baby, already lost him. I worked as a seamstress until my hands couldn't hold the needle steady anymore, lived in a studio apartment in Northeast until the building was sold. Social services placed me here 2 years ago. Medicare pays for it mostly. I have nowhere else to go." Marcus stood abruptly, pacing to the window where she had spent so many hours staring out at nothing. "You're wrong," he said firmly. "You have somewhere to go. You're coming home with me." Eleanor shook her head, her voice practical despite her tears. "Marcus, no. You don't owe me anything. I made my choice. And I'm making mine," he interrupted, turning back to her. "I have a guest house, fully equipped, private but close. I have resources, the best doctors, nurses if you need them. But more than that, I have 38 years of questions, 38 years of stories to share, 38 years of life to catch up on." His voice broke. "I have 38 years of telling you that you made the right choice, that your sacrifice gave me a life you couldn't have imagined." Eleanor rose unsteadily, and Marcus caught her as she swayed, holding his mother for the first time since he was 3 days old. She felt fragile in his arms, but her grip was strong as she clutched his shirt. "I loved you every day," she whispered against his chest. "Every single day, I loved you." "I know," Marcus whispered back, and surprisingly, he did. He thought of all the Thursday mornings, the pull he'd felt toward this stranger, who wasn't a stranger at all. Somewhere, somehow, I think I always knew. Chapter 4. 6 months later, Marcus stood in the kitchen of his Minnetonka home, watching through the window as Eleanor sat in the garden with his daughter Lily, who was visiting from college. The guest house had become Eleanor's home, decorated with new photographs that chronicled both their separate pasts and their intertwined present. The old photo album now sat on Marcus's coffee table, integrated into the story of his life, rather than separated from it. The transformation in Eleanor had been remarkable. Good nutrition, proper medical care, and most importantly, purpose had brought color back to her cheeks and strength to her voice. She volunteered now at the very orphanage where she'd left Marcus, reading to children, holding babies whose mothers were in situations similar to what hers had been. She'd become a grandmother not just to Lily, but to the 7-year-old twins from Marcus's first marriage, who called her Grandma Ellie and demanded her famous chocolate chip cookies every Sunday. Marcus brought out iced tea, settling beside them on the patio as Lily was saying, "Tell me again about the night you found each other, or recognized each other, or whatever we're calling it." Eleanor smiled, reaching over to squeeze Marcus's hand. "We're calling it a miracle disguised as coincidence," she said. "Though your father insists it was his algorithm that brought us together." "It wasn't the algorithm," Marcus admitted, something he'd never said aloud before. "I used to drive by Willowbrook all the time. It wasn't on my way to anywhere. I just felt pulled there. The volunteering was an excuse to explain what I couldn't understand." Lily, studying psychology at Stanford, leaned forward with interest. "There are studies about genetic attraction, cellular memory. Children separated from biological parents often report feeling drawn to places or people connected to their origins without knowing why. All I know," Eleanor said, her voice steady and sure, "is that love finds a way, even when it takes 38 years, even when it comes disguised as charity or duty or simple human kindness." She looked at Marcus, her eyes bright. "You gave me back my son, but more than that, you gave me forgiveness, not from you. You were never mine to ask forgiveness from, but from myself." Marcus thought about the platform his company had launched, connecting hundreds of families separated by circumstances beyond their control. Each reunion story that came through their system echoed something of his own journey, but none quite captured the complex grace of sitting here in the garden he'd built for success, with the mother who'd given him up for the same reason. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd kept me?" Marcus asked, a question he'd been afraid to voice for months. Eleanor considered this, her face thoughtful. "Every day for 38 years, she said simply. "But not anymore. Because I see who you became, the life you built, the good you do in the world. Could I have given you MIT? Could I have given you the confidence that comes from being chosen by the Chens, from being wanted so desperately by parents who could provide everything? You became who you are not, in spite of my choice, but because of it, and that has to be enough." "It's more than enough," Marcus said, watching as his children ran across the lawn, their laughter mixing with the sound of wind chimes Eleanor had hung from the oak tree. "It's perfect in its imperfection." That evening, as they sat together watching the sun set over Lake Minnetonka, Eleanor hummed the lullaby that had connected them across decades of separation. But now it had new words, ones she'd written for the grandchildren who would never know a morning without her love. "Sleep now, my darlings. Dream of the morning light. Though paths may wind and wander, love makes all things right. When you wake tomorrow, in arms that hold you near, remember, little ones, that love casts out all fear." Marcus pulled out his phone to record her singing. Not for any archive or project, but simply to capture this moment when the wound of abandonment had finally healed into something else entirely. A scar, perhaps, but one that told a story of sacrifice, resilience, and the inexorable pull of blood calling to blood across the years. He thought of the thousands of families his platform would reunite, each with their own complex tapestry of loss and redemption, and felt the weight of his own story settle into something bearable, even beautiful. The old woman had turned out to be his mother, but more than that, she'd turned out to be the answer to a question he'd never known how to ask. Not why was I left, but was I loved? The answer sat beside him, humming softly in the gathering dusk, her hand in his, both of them finally, impossibly, home.